Ladies and gents, we are here. The final group tier list. The heavy infantry, the elite infantry, the best infantry, whatever you want to call it. Woof. All right, for the final time, here's the spiel. If you haven't seen any of this series so far, it is a tier list taking every unit that fits a certain class description in the entire game, lumping them all together and creating a tier list on their effectiveness at their jobs. Now, a couple caveats there. One, this isn't for campaign or multiplayer specific. I will not be factoring in like certain factions have certain buffs for certain units, but then that doesn't work for any other thing. So it's like, how do I rate Storm Vermin? Do I rate Queek's Storm Vermin, or do I rate Clan Scryer's Storm Vermin, which are pretty terrible, right? You can't just do a tier list for every single faction all the time. It's just too confusing and terrible. So let's just take each unit and compare them to other units in their bracket for how effective they are. Second, I do mention gold a lot. People don't care about it as much in campaign, but it is a useful single metric to compare a unit to. If something costs 15,000 gold, but it has 100 melee attack and melee defense, if you were just ranking it on stats, you'd be like, well, it has 100 melee attack and melee defense, and this other unit that costs 1,000 has 50 melee attack and melee defense. So the one with 100 is better, even though it costs 15 times as much to get twice the stats. And then this tier list would just be which unit is the most expensive. Those are the best ones. Which one is the least expensive? They're the worst. That's not interesting. That's not fun. So gold can tell you how well a unit uses the stats given to it. Makes it a little more interesting. Last thing I'll mention is heavy infantry. There's a lot of different ways to categorize infantry. How I did it for this series is just their relative strength level on the faction they're on, where, because it's a tier list, I want to avoid saying tiers, but for the Skaven, light infantry was Skaven Slaves and Clan Rats. Mid-tier infantry was Plague Monks, Death Runners, Eshin Triads. And then high-tier infantry is going to be Storm Vermin and Plague Monks, Censer Bearers. Right. But saying heavy infantry often has an implication of armor. So I wanted to say elite infantry. But then some factions don't even have elite infantry, like Empire Greatswords and Bretonnian Foot Squires. I don't think they'd even fit the definition of elite infantry. They're pretty mid, right? So it's like, well, do some factions just not have elite infantry? What constitutes elite infantry? Certain infantry have high melee attacks, certain infantry have high melee defense, certain infantry have a lot of armor, certain infantry have a lot of leadership, and it is just too complicated. So to break this up, I just took every faction's top couple infantry, middle couple infantry, bottom couple infantry, split them into the groups. So these are all the best infantry of all the factions. Let's get into it, and starting out with Storm Vermin. I believe this is Storm Vermin Sword and Shield and the Storm Vermin Halberds. I'll put them in C tier. They have gotten some buffs recently, and Storm Vermin do have a higher model count than a lot of elite infantry, but they're still not very good. They can be niche useful on the Skaven roster, but once you put them in an arena with all other elite infantry in the game, Storm Vermin will come up lacking. Relatively cheap for relatively elite infantry. Still, their sword and board version is not as tanky as a lot of other tanky infantry in the game, and their halberd version is their only armor piercing, and that is not very good against anything besides incredibly large targets. And even then, they're susceptible to terror and collision attacks, so they're not great as far as heavy infantry go. Storm Vermin, sword and shield, or halberds kind of fall into C. They're okay, not really good. Plague Monk Censer Bearers are going to go down to D tier. Plague Monk Censer Bearers are almost viable, but they have too many weaknesses. For a high price point, having low armor, low leadership, and no spell resistance, these guys are weak to ranged fire, they're weak to collision attacks, they're weak to cavalry charges, they're weak to spells, obviously. The only things that they're good against is killing heavy infantry, because light infantry will trade well with Plague Monks, like for price wise, right? If you take Marauder Berserkers and you throw them at Plague Monks, the Berserkers will trade cost effectively with the Plague Monk Censer Bearers. But if you fight Chosen with Plague Monk Censer Bearers, Plague Monk Censer Bearers will perform admirably well against Chosen. So with a melee infantry unit that is only good against other heavy infantry with high armor values, it's just not enough of a niche for this unit to be good. It either needs to be a little cheaper, or I would prefer maybe a little tankier, or give them some significant spell resistance so that one Burning Head or Pendulum doesn't take them out. But as they currently are, they're just weak to too many things for a very niche application. Temple Guard. Also going to rock the C tier with the Storm Vermin. Temple Guard have some niche uses when they're next to a Lord. They get some buffs, either Unbreakable or like ITP or things like that. Have some Guardian stats, but generally this unit isn't that strong. It's a Halberd unit that's a high price point and they're pretty tanky, incredibly low on damage for their price point and very slow, so they have a hard time pursuing anything. They're just a defensive unit, but I think you'll find on this list there's other defensive units that are better. So the Temple Guard, kind of like the Plague Monk Censer Bearers, when you only have one thing you do well, stand next to your Lord and kill large targets, I guess, it's just not enough. That's not enough for your price point. A lot of spells will take you out rather quickly. Archers and cannons and stuff can ping you down. There's not much you can do about it. So Temple Guard, also in the C tier. Sword Masters of Hoeth. They'll be C as well. Now, I promise this list isn't just saying elite infantry are bad, so everything is C and D. I am thinking about them compared to other elite infantry, and there are stuff on this list that will get up in the S and A tier. But the Swordmasters of Hoeth is not the great place to start. Swordmasters are good. Similar to Plague Monk Censer Bearers, they are elite infantry killing elite infantry. Now, a little better than the Plague Monk Censer Bearers, Swordmasters can also kill almost infinite light infantry, whereas the Plague Monks will take a lot of damage. Swordmasters' crazy high stats usually keep them safe in that aspect, but they're still too weak to cavalry charges. They're still too weak to chariots, monsters, archers, skirmish cavalry, spells. There's just too much damage that the Swordmasters of Hoeth can take for their incredibly niche application of just killing other elite infantry. So, fortunately, not great. Oh, and they're elves, so they have really low HP, so anything hurts them quite a lot. And the Phoenix Guard are going to go there as well. Phoenix Guard, similar to the Swordmasters of Hoeth, but instead of being elite infantry killers, these are elite monstrous unit killers. Cavalry too, if cavalry is dumb enough to just charge them and stay in melee combat, but Phoenix Guard are decent at killing monstrous infantry and big single entities if they can get a maintained fight with them. The problem with the Phoenix Guard, and the problem with a lot of heavy infantry in the current meta or whatever, is that big monsters can just walk away from them. There's no reason for a big monster to stay on them. But even so, that's their niche and that's fine. The biggest problem is they're elven. They just don't have the HP to really sit and bump and grind. And stuff that's going to be higher on this list than them is stuff that can take a fight and stay in a fight. Phoenix Guard just don't withstand a melee very well. And especially spells, like one Pit of Shades just takes them out. So Phoenix Guard down here with Swordmasters of Hoeth, they're kind of like equally good units at fighting different things, but they end up in the same tier. Argoneth Executioners, however, are going to be our first to break into B tier. With their recent buffs, compared to other melee infantry, they recently got immune to psychology, meaning they don't just randomly terror out anymore, and they also got some damage buffs. And I've been seeing them recently. People are taking them to see how they do with the buffs, but just watching them perform overall, they do solid. They kill all the infantry, obviously. They're pretty fast at doing it. But then also, they do okay versus cavalry cycle charging them a little bit. And that ITP means they don't run from monsters. They don't run from nobody. I think Phoenix Guard also recently got ITP, but still, Argoneth Executioner is just a little better. And with Murderous Prowess and Murderous Mastery, I believe they get Murderous Mastery, so they get a bigger buff from their army passive going off, and that can really help them churn through things in the mid game for the Dark Elves. B is just fine, though, after all their buffs. This whole class of units is struggling in multiplayer for sure, but yeah, I think Argoneth Executioners just outperform Swordmasters of Hoeth a little bit across the board. Blackguard of Nagarond also going to be in C tier. Elven Halberds just don't have a great time. Their HP pools aren't there. They have high stats, but anything hitting them does a lot of damage. You've heard it ad nauseum with the Phoenix Guard, so I'll keep it short for Blackguard of Nagarond. High armor is neat. Low HP pools are not as neat. Blade Singers. That is a Blade Singer. This is the CA Content Creator Asset Kit, so it must be an older picture of them, but Blade Singers get up to B tier. Wood Elven Blender units, they are incredibly fast, low armor, but their speed just makes it impossible for any of their targets to actually escape from them, and they rely on heavy melee attack and melee defense stats to stay safe rather than armor values. The speed is really the big part, though, that gets them up into B, where Swordmasters and Phoenix Guard can sometimes just limp around after their targets, somewhat fast, but not fast enough to truly catch things. Blade Singers just sprint up to stuff and delete it, and their incredibly high melee attack and melee defense stats put them a little above Plague Monk Sensor Bearers in like the light armor infantry killing thing, because they don't rely on armor to stay safe. They just have a ridiculously high melee defense stats if you pop one of their dances that gives them that. So they'll be all right. Can kill infinite chaff and elite infantry. Still, like some of the other things we've mentioned, though, for elite infantry killers, they're weak to cavalry and archers and whatnot. But it is what it is, I suppose. Depth Guard are sitting down in D tier. Pole arms or their twin axe variant. Slow, squishy, expensive, low damage. Depth Guard are abysmally terrible. They need buffs in any direction. I wouldn't do every direction at once, or you'll end up with a toxic unit, but they either need to be cheaper, or in my preference, they need higher stats, higher HP, maybe some armor, make them tankier and more worthy of the name Depth Guard, but right now they're just kind of meh. Next up is Giant Slayers. There is our first S tier unit of this roster type. Fast, anti-large, armor-piercing, crazy high stats. And honestly, Giant Slayers can still do well against armored infantry. So they do great versus cavalry, light cavalry, armored infantry, single entities, monstrous infantry. They do well versus everything besides ranged units and enemy light infantry. Giant Slayers want to avoid those two, otherwise they will be happy as a clam to keep churning through all of your enemies. Unbreakable, 1200 gold with spell resistance. I did mention for a lot of the lower tier people on this list that they're very weak to spells. Giant Slayers laugh in the face of your spells with their spell resistance and spread formation. Sisters of Slaughter also going to end up in A tier. Blade Singers with a bit cheaper price point and a little more generic stats. Sisters of Slaughter are more generically helpful as they just sprint forward and poison things down. High melee defense, can kill things awfully quickly, being surprisingly tanky and just a little bit cheaper than the Blade Singer. So again, losing them isn't as big of a deal. Sisters of Slaughter, nice and fast and aggressive. Love to see it. Tomb Guard next up. Tomb Guard will be B tier. They are not very impressive in any way, but they are also much cheaper than a lot of the options on this list for doing their job. Basic Tomb Guard and Tomb Guard Halberds are cheaper than I think anything I've put on the list so far, and they do what you need them to do at that price point. Storm Vermin wish they were this cheap. They have some passive regeneration from the Tomb King's army passive as they fight, but most of the Tomb Guard Halberds are great at defending your backline from enemy cavalry, because it takes a while to kill Ushabti Greatbows. And the longer you sit there, the longer the halberds have to creep over, get beneath your hooves, and stab up into your horse bellies. So, Tomb Guards do their job. Their job requirements aren't too much. It's just like be tankier skeletons, and for the halberds, defend me from cav. But they do it. Graveguard will also go into B tier. Relatively cheap as far as the highest tier of infantry goes. Graveguard come with great weapon variant, sword and shield, and then halberd variant relatively recently. The halberd is pretty whatever, but in a blob fight they can do okay. Graveguard great weapons are good aggressive infantry at charging the enemy, and Graveguard with sword and shield are good anvils to just constantly apply pressure to a front line while your Blood Knights and Black Knights and Vargeist do a bunch of work elsewhere. So Graveguard and Tomb Guard both do fine for their low price point. Black Orcs. Black Orcs are going to go in A tier. Immune to psychology, tons of mass. So if cavalry overextends into fighting Black Orcs, or a single entity on a horse fights Black Orcs for a while, they will not be able to get out. They will get netted in place. And they have the Unstoppable Choppa's passive they can proc to reduce their own melee defense and increase their damage by 50%. I like that quite a lot for the Black Orcs. I believe I have the Sword and Shield later on. I'll just get rid of that because I generally don't like to do variants over and over and over again. But the Black Orc Great Weapon variant can get 50% more damage, which I really like when you're charging a front line with poor melee, poor armor piercing stats. So then when you're not worried about them getting through your armor at all, you can just kill them 50% faster, and that's very nice. Plus, when they get a wah, they can churn through a lot of people. And they're great versus cavalry, and they're great versus large monsters. The only thing, they're not weak to a specific unit type, they're just kind of weak to attrition for 1100 gold price point. They don't have the most elite stats, not like Blade Singers or Sisters of Slaughter, where their crazy high melee defense stops them from taking any poke ever. They do take poke over time, they will just slowly kind of get whittled down. But Black Orcs are very strong. Incredibly high HP pool, consistent pushers for the Greenskins. Very deserving of A tier. Great Swords for the Empire. Also going to go into B tier. For their low price point, Swordmasters would love to trade with Great Swords. Great Swords are only 850 gold, armor piercing, anti-infantry, decently high armor stats, relatively okay speed. That's about it. They have all the problems Swordmasters have, but for 400 gold less. So yeah, I'd rather have Great Swords than Swordmasters, to be honest, in most situations. Now 1v1, a Swordmaster would kill a Great Sword easily, maybe even a Great Sword and a half. But in the larger context of all things that can happen to a unit, I would rather take a Great Sword and a half over a Swordmaster. So just being cheaper at the same job is pretty damning for the High Elf elite unit. Ironbreakers of the Dwarves are going to go into A tier. Rather potent blasting charges, heavy spell resistance, nearly unbreakable leadership, decent melee attack, incredible melee defense. All of that sounds pretty good. The only reason that these guys are not in S tier is they are not very damaging. They have almost no armor piercing. They are terrible versus anything besides infantry, and even then, they don't kill most infantry. They just hold forever. They do have one job. That job is to be an unbreakable wall, and they do that amazingly well, but just not enough use cases for me to justify putting them in S, where it's like they do one thing and they're an S. You know, S is usually a little more generic, a little more generalist than that, but Ironbreakers are very, very, very solid. Can hold any front line. Hammerers, I feel bad putting them in B. I honestly think they deserve higher, but Hammerers just kind of struggle a little bit. You don't see them in multiplayer at all. And if this was just a multiplayer tier list of how units perform in the meta, they would be D tier. But that's because on their roster, Hammerers are completely outclassed by everyone else. Ironbreakers hold longer. Giant Slayers do more damage to all unit types. All their ranged weapons, Dwarves are amazing at killing large targets with ranged weapons. So they're just anti-infantry armor-piercing units for the most part. I don't think they even have an anti-infantry bonus, like a bonus versus infantry, but that's generally their only real use case, because large targets will avoid them. But I guess, you know, if you do wander a Slaughter Brute into Hammerers, it'll have a bad time, but you can just walk out at any point. Hammerers are okay, though. B tier, because if you consider them on their own, I mean, they have good stats. They're crazy slow because they're dwarves and they're heavily armored. But aside from being slow and kind of expensive, they have good stats. They can perform really well if they get a fight with something. Most units will just kite them out and whatever because they're crazy slow. So B tier for them. An incredible stat stick that you need to avoid at all costs, but not higher because it is pretty easy to just avoid them. Chosen. Chosen are A tier. Chosen have a lot of variety. There's Chosen dual weapons. There's Chosen with sword and shield. There's Chosen of Nurgle. There's Chosen of Slaanesh. There's Chosen of all kinds. Chosen with great weapons, halberds, what have you, Tzeentchian barriers, all these things. All of them land roughly in A tier. Chosen are just really, really good elite infantry. In metas where elite infantry are going to be strong, Chosen will be strong. They're good in blob fights. They're good at rushing enemy formations if you don't have good armor-piercing anti-infantry. They're good at holding defensive formations for hell cannons to fire. They're good at scaling walls. They're good at taking walls. They're good at taking gates and holding them. Chosen are good at a lot of things. Chosen are not as afraid of getting run down by cavalry as other elite infantry because they're one of the few elite infantry that pairs armor, melee defense, and armor piercing. Not all of their variants have melee defense and armor piercing, but enough of them have armor piercing that if cavalry try and cycle charge you, they'll honestly have a pretty bad time. Whereas like Phoenix Guard are too squishy and lightly armored that they won't have a great time fighting cavalry in a cycle charge situation. And then like Ironbreakers are heavily armored but don't have the oomph to push back. Chosen have both. The only reason Chosen are out of S tier is they are incredibly slow, and some of their all of their variants have a key weakness, and it just depends on what Chosen you're fighting, what the weakness is. Like Chosen Nurgle with great weapons are super weak to armor-piercing bullets because they don't have shields and they're slow, while Chosen of Slaanesh with Hell Scourges are much tankier against bullets because they have shields and they're a little bit faster and that kind of stuff. But then Chosen of Slaanesh with Hell Scourges are super weak to monsters cycle charging them with the collision attacks. So each of the Chosen has a different specific weakness that can be heavily abused, keeping them out of S. Marauder Champions back down to C tier with you. The sword and board variant is pretty tanky and takes a long time to get through a front line, but will eventually do it. For 1,000 gold and for 1,100 gold, the Marauder champion with great weapons will lose to any other armor-piercing infantry, and it loses its shield, so it can just get shot. Marauder champions are okay, but not good enough to justify their price point in most cases. You usually don't see Marauder champions. If you do, you see 1 or 2 Marauder champions with shields versus factions like Tomb Kings that honestly used to be bad at clearing out armored infantry, but now with the cats, honestly, even the couple matchups where these guys used to be good, they're not really anymore. So Marauder champions just not good enough at anything to really bother taking them. Foot Squires are down in D tier. Even at a 750 gold price point, they just don't compare to Tomb Guard well at all. Foot Squires are squishy, cowardly, unshielded, low stat fools. They can't stand up to other high tier infantry. So, no, they suck. Aspiring Champions going to go up to S tier as well. Aspiring Champions are uniquely tanky for infantry because they only have 12 or 16 models. They do not take that much damage from collision attacks. They do not take that much damage from getting charged by cavalry. They don't take that much damage from most spells. They are absurdly tanky with crazy high stats, high HP per model. And like I said, low model count, really diminishing the amount of spells you can use on them. Pit of Shades, Fate of Buna don't do nearly as much to these guys as other elite units. Aspiring Champions are S tier as far as elite infantry goes, especially the Severed Claw Regiment of Renown for Tzeentch. Wildwood Rangers, gonna go in C. Elven Elite Infantry. Their low mass and low HP pools make them susceptible to getting cycle charged, or collision attacked, or charioted, or shot. Outside of that, fast, high damage, good for them, but not enough to make them good. Just keeps them out of D. Best of Gores, the worst of Gores. I hate Best Score herds. My hatred of them is long-standing and well-known. Their stats are low, their price point is high, their leadership sucks, this unit sucks. Best Scores are terrible. Great Axe Infantry that charge forward and do nothing. Exalted Demonettes of Slaanesh will pop up to A tier. Demonic unit that is very squishy, not great. Those are the two big negatives, and those are big negatives. Their price point's also a little high, but Exalted Demonettes put out insane damage versus any infantry they run into. They can also put out a lot of damage versus a rampaging monster. If that monster is locked down and they get up to it and hit it, they will cleave through that thing in no time at all. So their damage is insane, similar with cavalry, and when they're paired up with the rampages of Slaanesh, they can actually sometimes get fights where your opponent can't just pull out as soon as they fight them. And that's where the Demonettes will shine. So Demonettes, insane damage at a crazy high speed, both speed of DPS and literal speed. These guys are fast as hell. Just a little squishy, so you do have to get them into the fight you wanted them to be in quickly. Otherwise, archers and stuff will ping them down. Exalted Plague Bearers. As far as heavy infantry go, I'm going to go with A tier. This is where I'll remind my multiplayer folks that I am rating this infantry category as this infantry category, not how heavy infantry is currently doing. Are Exalted Plague Bearers A tier across the entire meta? No, but heavy infantry is not having a great time. As far as heavy infantry goes, though, Exalted Plague Bearers are fantastic. Tanky, high weapon strength, high melee stats, especially melee defense, and their grenades makes them a pseudo halberd unit that doesn't have bonus versus large. But if a large target, cavalry or monsters, get involved with Exalted Plague Bearers, the grenades do a ton of damage, and if you try to dodge the grenades by getting into melee with them, you're going to regret that too. So large targets have to avoid Exalted Plague Bearers. Exalted Plague Bearers also trade pretty well against most infantry. The things they are weak to is anti-infantry infantry, and archers. Archers or artillery of any kind do really good into Exalted Plague Bearers. Since they have low armor and not a lot of missile resistance or shields, you really got to kill these guys at range. Taking the fight to them in most cases is not going to go well for you. Zargard back down to C tier. Zargard's sword and board are pretty solid as just frontline pushers with high stats, high armor, shields, and unbreakable from the Buyer Blood. Zargard with great weapons are kind of underperforming middling units. I don't really notice them doing particularly well. Either of them does not hold up great on this tier list compared to the stuff above it, like Hammerers would body either form of Zargard, and they're about the same price. So, Zargard are kind of okay, like a lot of the C tier stuff, just nothing to bring them up to B. Exalted Bloodletter is going to go back in A tier as well. Similar to the Demonettes, fast, incredible damage output. They're a little tankier than the Demonettes, but also do a little teeny tiny bit less damage. But since they are Cornate, they do have a strong spell resistance, which can be quite nice. Since dealing with a lot of heavy infantry is spell reliant, like Pit of Shades or Fate of Buna, Burning Head, things like that, Exalted Bloodletters can withstand a lot of it due to the Corn plus 25% spell resist. So they're quite nice at that. Good armor piercing, good anti-infantry stats. Really hate fighting cavalry though, and single entities. So they are just infantry focused killers. Celestial Dragon Guard get an absolute D tier. After the patch, I was playing some Grand Cathay, and every time I've tried to use Celestial Dragon Guard, they've disappointed me. They are terrible. They do no damage. They're somehow not even that tanky for being how expensive they are. They just do nothing. Basic Jade Warriors are better. Like, honestly, I feel like they're better in the moment, too. Like, somehow a Jade Warrior will last longer than a Celestial Dragon Guard. They're just terrible. Even though they're armored and shielded, they feel weak to missiles, they're weak to spells, they're weak to anti-infantry units. They're only good against cavalry that happens to sit directly on top of them instead of leaving. Celestial Dragon Guard have disappointed me for the last time. Doomseekers will join Celestial Dragon Guard in D tier, and this might be a hot take among the Dowie players, but the big thing I'll remind you is that gold matters. These are the most expensive Slayers by far. They're 400 more gold than Giant Slayers. They do worse than Giant Slayers against everything besides armored infantry, and even that is a close contest. Doomseekers are terrible. Their attack animations are too jaunty and extreme, where it feels like they spend a lot of time just doing animations instead of swinging. They're very squishy to a lot of things because they're Slayers. They don't have armor or anything like that. And where the Giant Slayers are better at killing monsters and cavalry and still fine versus infantry, Doomseekers are good against infantry. End of list. They do nothing against large targets as far as I've seen. So, no, Doomseekers are pretty terrible for their extreme price point. They're more expensive than Demonettes, Exalted Demonettes and Bloodletters. They're as expensive as Chosen. Remember that. They're as expensive as Chosen. They are not Chosen in performance. I believe this is the Infernal Ironsworn, and those are going to be S tier. These are the Iron Breakers of the Chaos Dwarves. They're insanely powerful blasting charges. Put them in S tier. They have strong defensive stats. They do a good amount of damage in melee. They have incredibly high melee defense. They have a lot of armor, all that stuff. But the blasting charges on these guys are absolutely nuts. They're high weapon strength, even though they're non-armor piercing blasting charges anymore after some nerfs. They still can take out most infantry in one volley and push them away. Infernal Ironsworn are just insane. They're very, very strong units. Infernal Guard, however, go down to D tier. Even with their buffs, I tried them a bit today. Infernal Guard with great weapons are too easy to kill in every aspect. Like anti-infantry, infantry will do a lot of damage to them. Chariots do a lot of damage to them. Our ranged units do a lot of damage to them. Monsters do a lot of damage to them. So it's like, oh, well, these aren't good versus anything. In the shield variant, why don't you just get Infernal Ironsworn and get the super dope blasting charges for just a little bit more money? The Infernal Guard have no reason to exist, and they're D tier. Finally, the Wrathmongers. Ooh, nope, they're the Black Orcs I was looking for. I'm going to delete you because I kind of factored you in with the Great Weapon Black Orcs. Wrathmongers round out our final S tier. With their DLC, I was not sure these guys would be any good, but after testing them a bit, it turns out they are amazing. Wrathmongers combine the Blade Singer thing I was talking about, where they're crazy high stats, make sure they don't take any damage versus low tier infantry. They pair that with the high armor of everybody else, so now even if you get a blow or two in, it doesn't do that much damage. And then they factor in the Aspiring Champions low model count. It's not as low as Aspiring Champions, but it's low. So a lot of the spells that could try and take these guys out don't do as much damage to them. But oh wait, they're Khorne, so they also have spell resistance. High armor, high resist, high stats, and an incredibly high price point of 1750 gold. They still make it worth it. Wrathmongers are very, very strong and probably top this list. They're probably the best heavy infantry in the game, even factoring in cost. But I just kind of put them in the order they were in. But they're S plus tier. Wrathmongers are fantastic, and it is fitting that Khorne would have the best fighter in the entire game. That is our heavy infantry list, and the final list we will be doing. I don't know if it'll release as the final list we've done, but who knows what order I'll edit these and put them out. Hopefully you enjoyed the series. We are done with the series now. We've covered every unit type, so every unit in the entire game ended up on these tier lists at some point, except for probably 2 or 3 across the whole series. People could point out that I missed somehow, just due to, for some reason, that unit's card not being in CA's Master Collection kit, or maybe I accidentally deleted it when I was filtering out some redundancies. I don't know, it happens. But I got like 99% of units in the entire game. I think that's a good achievement, and hopefully you enjoyed. A goodbye. Roar. Subscribe, yes, yes.